Defendant laughed after cutting off her head.
Yes, but how did she plead? Something similar here from the Illawarra Mercury.
He had shot himself in the head with a .38 caliber revolver before leaving several suicide notes, the police said.
Obviously no suspicion of foul play. And back to the Adelaide Advertiser's court rounds person.
He took into account mitigating factors, including Roger's age and hitherto unblemished criminal record.
And so, good evening. A single theme really for this week's programme, non-news, how to make it and how to break it. Non-news can be found even on the front page of The Australian, as it was a little over a week ago.
Lyndon Johnson delivered an urgent plea to Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies in 1964 for a dramatic lift in Australia's commitment to the Vietnam War.
And now the non-news?
It was revealed for the first time in official documents released yesterday.
Christopher Dorr placed heavy emphasis on the fact that the LBJ letter had only just come to light.
In a previously secret personal letter to Menzies, dated December the 14th, 1964, Johnson sought more Australian support in Vietnam and raised the prospect of a combat role for Australian troops.
Inside, the Australian printed the letter in full, and it is plainly of historic significance. LBJ praises Ming for
the courageous steps your government took in presenting a conscription law to Parliament.
And here's the part about sending troops.
If the situation in Saigon should require and justify it, there may be a need for some combat units.
The Australians' extensive treatment of the story included a column by Greg Pemberton, who thought that the letter,
released yesterday in its entirety, has a double historical significance. It demolishes Vietnam War myths of both left and right.
Well, I somehow doubt that, but it is clearly significant. The trouble is, it isn't news. This is the same Greg Pemberton's book, All the Way, published in 1987, wherein on page 257 he quotes extensively from the letter.
If the situation in Saigon should require and justify it, there may be a need for combat units. Footnote 24.
We could hardly wait to get to footnote 24. After all, in February 1995, Pemberton's treating the letter as a just revealed state secret, but he was able to quote from it 8 years ago. So, footnote 24.
Letter, Johnson to Menzies, probably drafted by Cooper, 14th of December 1964, cited in Sexton, Op. Cit.
Sexton's opus is this book,
War for the Asking, Australia's Vietnam Secrets.
Published by Penguin in 1981, hardly an obscure work, wherein the letter is reproduced. And we won't read from it a third time. So, who do the Australians think they're kidding? Michael Sexton had the LBJ letter at least 14 years ago. Pemberton certainly knew that. The only parts of the letter not set out in Sexton's book were unimportant detail about materiel, water supply and bicycles. So the Aussies' performance would appear to be simultaneously incompetent and disingenuous. And let's move on to our next furphy.
The worldwide head of Ford, Alexander Trotman, has told Business Review Weekly that the abolition of tariffs, combined with better working conditions, makes it uneconomical to make cars in Australia.
The closure threat came in an interview given to the Business Review Weekly, where the US parent's boss said, "We are building on our strengths now. Don't wait for the bad times before you act."
The latest shadow was cast by today's edition of Business Review Weekly, which Ford was quick to deny. President John Ogden said plans to replace the Falcon are on target.
Business Review Weekly set the alarm bells ringing, with reports the company's world chairman, Alexander Trotman, was considering ceasing Australian production.
It's not the first time Ford has threatened to pull out of Australia, but according to Business Review Weekly, this time they mean it.
But this magazine headline, based on an interview with the company's American president, suggested the Ford era might be coming to an end.
And so sensational was this news that it warranted multiple interviews with Peter Cook, Martin Ferguson, Phil Goode, Simon Crean, and BRW's editorial director. Yet no interview with anyone from Ford. The Melbourne Prince went mad with it too.
Crunch time.
Cut costs or we quit. Warning.
A city that lives or dies with Ford.
In a sense, where Ford goes, so goes Australian manufacturing industry.
A news release from the company shortly denied the story.
There are no plans to close our manufacturing operations in Australia.
So what's it all about? Well, it was nothing more than a sales pitch from Robert Gottliebsen flogging the new issue of his magazine, Business Review Weekly. He pumped out this crummy little media release.
To chiefs of staff and news directors.
And in a hasty blurb in which
Ford workers
was spelled as one word and
competitive
was spelled as you see it here, Whispering Bob was asking news chiefs to tell the world that
the world chief of Ford, Alexander Trotman, has announced that manufacturing of Ford motor vehicles in Australia will cease unless there is substantial reduction in costs.
Really, Bob? An announcement? That sounds somewhat formal, but yes.
The announcement was made in an interview with Business Review Weekly.
Pig's bum it was. This is the BRW spread. There's no interview with Mr. Trotman. The most generous view you could take is that Gottliebsen heard the Ford man speak at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland 5 weeks ago and had a word with him afterwards.
Trotman agreed to talk to BRW about Australia.
But, Bob, where is that talk? Not a single quote. The very few words ever attributed to Trotman in the article are from his speech, and they are not about Australia. So this one's not a story about Ford leaving Australia. It's a story about how easy it is to beat up some very old non-news and fool people who ought to know better. Had they read this story from the Fairfax Herald 6 weeks earlier?
Ford Australia's management has cause for optimism.
Or this from the Fin Review at the same time.
Ford boss expects decision on local production within 6 months.
Indeed, if you go back to 1988, you can see what a hardy perennial this story is.
Ford Motor Company would cut back its $1.2 billion investment commitment in Australia unless its local subsidiary lifted its profit performance dramatically.
Still, journalists don't have time for that sort of research, do they? And Gottliebsen must have been laughing as he dropped extra magazines off at the newsagents, listening as he did to his car radio.
BRW's Robert Gottliebsen believes the threat is serious.
Trotman could be bluffing, but I don't think so.
Business Review Weekly's Robert Gottliebsen says the future looks uncertain for Ford workers.
Oh, I think it's more likely to shut than stay open.
Mr. Gottliebsen agrees we're just not competitive enough.
Editor of Business Review Weekly, Robert Gottliebsen, says it's a threat that has to be taken seriously.
We don't blame him, he's in trade. We blame them. They're supposed to be in the news business. The problem becomes even more acute when you're in trade and news, as a trip to Wagga Wagga reveals.
And just before tonight's sport, Wagga Fire Brigade was called to Prime's Wagga Studios today, fearing the worst after reports of fire. Doug Hogan has the details.
The Wagga fireys were called to help cool down the Prime Studios. There was no smoke nor flames, but the boys were certainly curious. They persisted with a shower of water just in case. Inside, staff were previewing TV's hottest new drama, aptly titled Fire, featuring Wagga's own Wayne Pygram. It debuts on Prime Television tonight.
More than a minute of news time spent on plugging the station's new drama. Then there's news so soft that you have to contrive an angle. It used to be done by setting up a painfully posed novelty photograph, but nobody does that anymore. Nobody except the Courier Mail. Mr. Murdoch's Brisbane photographers must be world champions in posing silly shots of dancers to plug the Gold Coast Youth Ballet, a dancer who's still at school, a dancer who runs a fishing shop, a dancer who catches the bus, and a dancer who lives at the beach. Equally painful pictures for stories about dinosaur fossils, a new postage stamp, water-resistant rifles, a musical competition, snakes, more snakes, hats, I think, not sure about this one, and women lifting a jockey. The Courier Mail, a living museum of 50s journalism. Our next epitome of non-news is the special treatment given to anything involving news people. How was it that on Wednesday, when there was nothing new on the Packer Fairfax Keating story, events at Fairfax still led every TV bulletin in Sydney? How was it? Here's how it was.
Tonight, the battle for Fairfax turns into a media melee.
And pressure shows as the battle for Fairfax intensifies.
Emotions boil over in the battle for Fairfax newspapers.
Heading the 5 o'clock news, crash through or crash for the Fairfax boss.
Get out of my way!
The person over whom Mr. Mullholland stumbled was a 7 Network cameraman, which gave 7 News a special proprietary interest in this non-story. Talk about self-righteous.
Good evening. The battle for control of Fairfax erupted violently today as the newspaper group's chief executive let fly at a camera crew. A furious Stephen Mullholland lashed out at a 7 Nightly News cameraman and abused waiting media.
Get out of my way.
It was an extraordinary outburst from a man under intense pressure. Fairfax Chief Executive Stephen Mullholland let loose with a very public tantrum, kicking a news cameraman in the shins.
And we can only record how impressed we are that between them, 7 News and the Today Tonight turkeys repeated that footage no fewer than 10 times in 1 hour. It's reported that the cameraman wants to take action against Mr. Mullholland. Perhaps Mr. Mullholland will consider prosecuting him for obstructing a public thoroughfare. And finally, the Launceston Examiner probably thought it had got away with its news that turned out not to be, but it hasn't.
Waverly Mill likely to close.
Launceston's Waverly Woollen mills may close within weeks with the loss of 100 jobs.
It's a big story for the city, no doubt about that. But the parallel with the Ford factory closure is a trifle piquant. Next day in the Examiner,
Waverly Woollen Mills was installing or upgrading almost $750,000 of machinery and had no intention of leaving Launceston. The mill's general manager, Mr. John Fay, confirmed yesterday.
Eh?
The management of Waverly Woollen Mills has no short or long-term plans to close the Tasmanian part of its operation.
Mr. Fay said.
Who do we blame for this non-story then? Well, the Examiner says it's all Mr. Fay's fault.
He was contacted by the Examiner last Thursday to respond to industry concerns that the mill might soon close, but Mr. Fay said he did not wish to comment.
Ah, serves him right then, doesn't it? Good night to you.
Tonight, join Maxine McHugh and Max Walsh for the latest news and issues from the world of business, The Bottom Line. That's at 10:35. Right after our news update, the comedy series Bottom.